Okay, so I want to talk about Arthur Clarke's The Sentinel, which is a really uh, interesting piece of science fiction and possibly a familiar story to you. I know 2001 Space Odyssey doesn't hold the sort of mystique that it did at one point in time, so you may or may not have seen it, but you've probably heard of it. And of course, The Sentinel is um, sort of the predecessor to that. So, in terms of its story, it's not very complicated, right? You have a crew, a small crew of essentially explorers. They're geologists, cartographers. Um, they're sort of mapping and exploring the moon, and it's a sort of permanent expedition, right? It's an ongoing expedition to thoroughly investigate the surface of the moon, and they discover this small uh, technological object, which it takes them a period of time to be able to open eventually through atomic force. So in terms of plot, there's not a whole lot of mystery there. It doesn't really build a lot of suspense. There is not necessarily a lot of surprise. It is represented in a straightforward, very matter-of-fact, kind of realistic way. It does have an open plot, right? So if you ever wanted an example of a story with an open plot, here you go. It almost begins at the end, right? Where you have the destruction of the object, and actually the destruction of the object is the beginning of what we're led to believe is going to be a far more significant chain of events. Because as it turns out, the object dubbed the Sentinel is one of many scattered across the universe by this impossibly ancient race of aliens that sends out a persistent signal until it is disrupted. And when that object is destroyed, the signal is disrupted, which lets those who had left it know this is a suitable society to return to. Now, what's interesting about this is that it all hinges on atomic energy. And one of the things that we see, there are a handful of technological developments that, they are truly impactful, right, in terms of not just kind of everyday living, but in terms of the entire sort of worldview of humanity, and very existentially important. And those become real key markers in science fiction, obviously. So, early on in science fiction, you have to deal with things like human evolution and and some of the geological discoveries that are coming about in the 19th century in terms of the age of the Earth being much, much older than people had generally thought it to be. The discovery and proliferation of the fossil record had profound impact on the way people understood human life. The publications of Darwin's treatises on natural and sexual selection. So that's an early one for science fiction, where you really see, like, this is something that if you're going to write in the genre, you can't ignore, because it's so profoundly important to everyone for all people, whether they read your story or not, right? But you can't ignore it. There's no way to ever have science fiction after those particular scientific discoveries that looks like science fiction before those scientific discoveries. The same is true for the development of atomic energy. Once we have developed atomic energy, all of the science fiction leading up to that speculate about atomic energy and what that looks like and how it can be used are fundamentally different than all of the science fiction that comes after, right? Because before you have atomic energy, you have all this speculation about, like, well, that's how you're going to get to the moon, for example. You're going to build rockets that are driven by atomic energy. And then once you've actually got this atomic energy, the notion of sort of propelling a rocket with humans on it using this atomic power no longer seems feasible, right? And so it's kind of one of those things, I guess, if you think about it, it has to be seen to be believed, right? And once the speculation about atomic energy is over, once people have seen the power, right? And we're talking 1945, I think. 1945 was Hiroshima, I believe, right? The dropping of the atomic bomb by the Americans on Japan at the end of 1945. So at the end of World War II. What by today's standards, relatively small, 13 kiloton atomic bomb, 80,000 dead instantly, right? And the dramatic pictures of the mushroom clouds and so forth, and the destruction. Once you've seen that, right? Once humanity as a whole has witnessed that power, your conceptions about it and how it can be implemented and how it can be controlled and what the possession of that power means for humanity existentially. Not for Americans, not for Soviets, not for the Japanese, right? For global humanity, what our unlocking of that power means fundamentally changes the way that we look at that energy. And so what's interesting about Clarke is when you look at the Sentinel, it's written in 1951, so you've already had the development of the atomic power in the 1940s, culminating with the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945. You're heading into a period of atomic proliferation. And the story really becomes a speculation about what now. Right, that we thought the unlocking of atomic energy was going to be the culmination of technology, that this would bring answers for us, that it would allow the expansion of the human race into the galaxy, that it could open up branches of nuclear medicine that might be tremendously important to curing disease, and have been, actually, right? In a lot of ways. Tremendously important. But all of a sudden now, the only thing that matters about atomic energy is its potential as a weapon. We've seen this energy weaponized now, and now there is real concern. For the first time ever, that we actually could eliminate ourselves. Right? Human history is absolutely marred by genocidal attempts going way back into our prehistory, right? Where one group tries to eliminate another group for cultural or religious or political, economic reasons, whatever. Rarely did a group have the power to actually be able to do that. All of a sudden, with atomic energy, not only does one group have the power to exterminate another group, we actually have the power to exterminate everyone. And potentially accidentally. Right? That it's possible that we screw around and just destroy ourselves by accident while we're messing with this stuff. So this is what the story builds up to, right? It's pages and pages of this sort of mundane, like, they're in this really cool kind of lunar crawler that's essentially like a space Winnebago. Because I'm weird like this, I always think of Spaceballs. If you've ever seen Spaceballs, the great Mel Brooks movie. If you haven't, for the love of God, go watch it right now, then finish this video. I always think of the Winnebago that Lone Star flies around in. That's what they're essentially going across the moon in this sort of 1970s esque Winnebago. They're taking turns making sausage and eggs and looking out the window. And I mean, it's this very sort of homey, everyday kind of thing. Like, here we are, we're just on the moon, right? Set, by the way, in 1996. Which is 45 years in the future, which is a little farther out, actually, than what most science fiction peaks. But it culminates with this really dramatic, not event necessarily, but it's a psychological event, right? An emotional event where there's a realization by the narrator of what this means, right? So they're called the Wanderers, right? That they came into the solar system at some tremendously ancient period in time. And they saw the Earth in its early period of formation. No intelligent life there, but they saw potential for life. Just like we're doing now when we use the telescopes and the probes and stuff that we have now. Think of the Kepler project and the number of planets that we have begun to catalog. That may be suitable for life. And here he says, okay, so the Wanderers came through. They saw Earth very, very young, nothing there now noteworthy, but they saw the potential for life. So they place a Sentinel on the moon. And he realizes, right? And he says to himself, if I can just read these last couple paragraphs to you, this is so profound, right? Perhaps you understand now why that crystal pyramid was set upon the moon instead of on the Earth. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, the first time you read through the story, no, man, I don't realize, right? So it's a sort of ironic statement, but it's really, he's going to explain it to you, right? This is the point. He says, perhaps you realize it, perhaps you don't, but here's the deal, right? Its builders were not concerned with races still struggling up from savagery. They would be interested in our civilization only if we proved our fitness to survive. Okay, so it's very Darwinian sort of language here. By crossing space and so escaping from Earth, our cradle. So they're interested in us when we're able to leave Earth. So, big surprise, these very advanced space travelers are only interested in civilizations who are also space-faring civilizations. Fair enough. And he goes on to say then, that is the challenge that all intelligent races must meet sooner or later. It is a double challenge, for it depends in turn upon the conquest of atomic energy. And hear this. And the last choice between life and death. Once we had passed that crisis, it was only a matter of time before we found the pyramid and forced it open. Now its signals have ceased, and those whose duty it is will be turning their minds upon Earth. Perhaps they wish to help our infant civilization, but they must be very, very old, and the old are often insanely jealous of the young. So, what he's saying here, right, it's a double challenge. It depends upon the conquest of atomic energy, which they had done in 1951, but also the last choice between life and death. the choice of how to use that atomic energy, that once we had controlled it, that we would not use it to destroy ourselves, that we have to survive that power long enough to then be able to go into space and explore and to colonize. And he's hypothesizing here that by the late 90s, we will have achieved that we will have overcome this existential threat posed by the control of atomic power. You'll notice it is not a regret of the development of the atomic power. There are a lot of times speculation that those involved in the Manhattan Project and other developmental projects regret, right? Oppenheimer and others regret having discovered this secret to unlocking atomic power. And what Clarke is saying here is it was inevitable. It's inevitable as an intelligent race that at some point you are going to want to go to the stars, and along the way is the secret of atomic energy. But that once you've unlocked that, you have to not destroy yourself. Now, this is really interesting because, I have this weird interest in these like ancient alien shows and stuff like that. And this is something that that people who believe in these ancient alien civilizations, like the one that Clarke is speculating on here in the story, talk about, which is that these advanced civilizations really have no interest in pre-nuclear societies. And so they speculate that there's been a ramping up of UFO activity since we developed atomic energy, because that makes us more interesting to really advanced civilizations. And that's what he's speculating here. Now, I'm not saying that that's true in actuality, but for those of you who are looking for a connection, right, that there is a connection to that we recognize in the discovery and the control of atomic power, a fundamental step in the evolution of our species. Not our biological evolution, but our intellectual and cultural evolution. That there are opportunities available to you once you have this kind of technology at your command, but it poses in some ways a problem not unlike those dealt with in a lot of ancient mythologies, where now that you have this power, how do you learn to use it responsibly when it poses such a tremendous threat? And I think, understanding that the story is written less than a decade, 5-6 years. So I'm not sure exactly at what point in 51 it was written, but 5 or 6 years after we used, and I say we, he's British, but the Allied forces, right, used the atomic bomb to effectively terminate the Pacific campaign in World War II. He's not using this as a sort of moral platform to talk about whether or not that bomb ever should have been dropped. But looking at it from a global humanity perspective, that it was an inevitable step, but that the question becomes what you do with it. All against the backdrop of civilizations far older than ours. That the suggestion that we're not the first, and that we won't be the last, but that this is a question that we should be concerned with, because the suggestion here is that there have been other civilizations that have obliterated themselves with this power. Which is, one of those things that people have speculated about. Was there life on Mars at some point? Did they obliterate themselves, right? Was there life on some other planet? Did they obliterate themselves? So I think it's one of those stories where it's at the middle of this kind of turning point, and while it has this very open plot right at the end, where he says, right, what a great last line, by the way, right? I do not think we will have to wait for long. The idea that we've triggered this alarm, we've pulled the fire alarm, and they're coming. That these extraterrestrials, whoever they are and wherever they are drawn now to us because of our control of atomic power, whether they're coming for benevolent reasons or not. The story almost has to be open-ended because what Clark is interested in is not what we've done, but what we will do. What comes next? We've got the power. We've cracked the egg. We've opened the Pandora's box, right? We destroyed the Sentinel. We pulled the fire alarm. What now? Right, and it's a sort of way of saying, look, you can regret all you want. You can debate whether or not the bomb should have been dropped. You can do all of these things. Or what you can say is, well, what we know is we've got the power, and we've seen the power. Now, can we not control the power, but control ourselves? Let's wait and see what happens next. The fact that the story is set in 1996 suggests that Clark was hopeful that we would. And in some ways, against all odds, right, we made it through the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and this tremendous proliferation, so that now we're in a period of relative de-escalation. I'll leave it up to you if you're interested in these sorts of things, but we are still well over the threshold in terms of the number of nuclear warheads that would be required for total annihilation, right? We're way beyond that still. So one of the things that we have to ask when we read this is, it's been now 70 years. We've not managed to use this power to do the things that Clark speculates maybe we're destined to do with it. We have managed to fend off our own annihilation so far, but we really haven't tipped over one way or another. Our plot is still open. And I think it's just a tremendous story in terms of creating introspection, to where you read the story and you sit down and you think to yourself, what's the conclusion of this story? And we still don't know, which is super profound to think about.